Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place where curiosity is allowed to slow down, stretch out, and rest for a while. If you're listening as the day finally loosens its grip, or perhaps as the room grows darker and quieter around you, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight's journey is not one that rushes forward. It doesn't demand belief, agreement, or even full attention. It simply invites you to listen, the way you might listen to rain on a distant roof. Before we begin, if these slow explorations bring you comfort, you're always welcome to like the video, subscribe, or leave a small note about where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. There's something quietly comforting about knowing that many minds are resting together, each in a different corner of the night. Now settle in. Let your breathing find its own rhythm, and if your thoughts wander, that's perfectly fine. We'll keep going gently, whether you follow every word or drift in and out of sleep. Tonight, we begin with a sentence that may sound strange at first, even a little unsettling, but we'll hold it softly. What if you're already in the afterlife? Not as a destination you arrive at someday, not as a reward or a judgment waiting beyond death, but as a layer of reality you are already embedded in. A background state of existence that doesn't begin when the body ends, but simply becomes clearer when certain limitations fall away. This idea doesn't come from ancient scripture or mystical revelation alone. Versions of it appear quietly across neuroscience, philosophy of mind, and even certain edges of modern physics. And yet, it's rarely framed this way, perhaps because it gently undermines one of our most familiar assumptions, that life is the main event, and whatever comes after must be something entirely separate. To explore this, we don't need to imagine glowing tunnels or distant realms. We only need to look carefully at how perception works, and how much of reality is already filtered out before it ever reaches awareness. Consider for a moment how little of the world you actually experience. You don't hear every sound, only a narrow range. You don't see all light, only a thin slice between what we call red and violet. You don't feel the countless signals moving through your body every second. Instead, your experience arrives carefully edited, trimmed down, simplified into something manageable. This isn't a flaw. It's a survival feature. Your brain, remarkable as it is, does not exist to show you reality as it truly is. Its job is to keep you alive, and to do that, it must reduce, compress, and ignore almost everything. Imagine trying to live while fully aware of every sound wave, every electromagnetic ripple, every chemical reaction happening inside and around you. You wouldn't be enlightened, you'd be overwhelmed. So the brain acts less like a window and more like a pair of sunglasses. Not hiding the sun, but dimming it just enough so you can function. Not revealing the full spectrum, but selecting what matters for movement, hunger, danger, and social connection. Most of the time, we forget we're wearing those sunglasses. The filtered world feels complete, solid, final. But every now and then something interesting happens. A dream feels more real than waking life. A sudden insight arrives without effort. A moment of deep calm expands beyond the edges of the body. Or a near-death experience leaves someone convinced they briefly touched something wider, clearer, and strangely familiar. Rather than dismissing these moments, tonight we'll treat them as gentle clues. Not proof of anything supernatural, but hints that consciousness may not be created by the brain so much as shaped by it. One way to think about this is to imagine consciousness as a kind of signal and the brain as a receiver. Not a producer, but a tuner, a device that narrows a vast field of possibility into a single survivable channel. Much like a radio that selects one station from countless signals passing invisibly through the room. In this view, everyday waking life is not the full broadcast. It's one carefully selected frequency. And death, then, would not be the moment the music stops. It would be the moment the dial loosens. This idea may feel unfamiliar, especially in cultures shaped by the belief that consciousness lives entirely inside the skull, that when the brain stops, experience must vanish with it. But that assumption is surprisingly recent in human history, and not as secure as it often appears. In fact, even modern neuroscience quietly acknowledges that perception is not a direct recording of the world. It's a best guess, a prediction, a useful illusion that keeps the organism moving forward. What you experience as now is already delayed, edited, and assembled from fragments. So when we talk about the afterlife in this series, we're not talking about somewhere else. We're talking about what remains when the editing slows down, when the compression eases, when the interface we call ordinary life no longer has to do its job. You don't have to accept this idea. You don't even have to like it. You can simply let it sit beside you, the way you might let a strange thought pass through your mind just before sleep. As we continue, we'll explore why Western science often looked away from this possibility, how different cultures ask different questions, and why certain human experiences keep pointing in the same quiet direction. For now, just rest with this single thought, held gently and without urgency. If the afterlife exists, it may not be waiting for you. It may already be here. If the thought that you might already be living inside something larger still lingers in the background of your mind, there's no need to resolve it. Tonight isn't about answers. It's about noticing what has always been quietly present. To understand how a wider reality could exist without overwhelming us, it helps to look closely at how the brain shapes experience in the first place. Not as a machine that shows the world as it is, but as a careful editor, trimming away nearly everything so that what remains is usable, familiar, and safe. Imagine stepping outside on a bright afternoon. The sunlight is intense, almost blinding. Without thinking, you put on sunglasses. Instantly the world softens, colours mute, edges become easier to look at. Nothing essential disappears, but the experience becomes manageable. After a few minutes, you forget the glasses are even there. The filtered version feels normal. This is remarkably similar to how perception works. Your senses receive far more information than your awareness could ever handle. Sounds far beyond hearing range pass through you constantly. Light outside the narrow band your eyes can detect fills the space around you. Even inside your body, countless signals move between cells, organs, and systems without ever becoming conscious sensations. If all of that arrived at once, life would feel less like clarity and more like noise. So the brain does something subtle and deeply intelligent. It reduces the incoming flood to a thin stream. It chooses what matters for balance, movement, hunger, threat, and social connection. Everything else fades into the background, not because it is unreal, but because it is unnecessary for survival. What we call normal consciousness is the result of this reduction. Over time, the reduction becomes so familiar that it feels complete. We mistake the edited version for the whole picture, and because everyone around us is wearing the same perceptual sunglasses, we rarely question whether anything has been left out. But occasionally the filter slips. You might recognize moments like this. A sudden feeling of knowing something without being able to explain how. A dream so vivid that waking life feels slightly dim by comparison. A moment of deep stillness where the usual chatter of thought quiets, and awareness feels spacious, almost boundless. These moments don't usually last long. The filter gently slides back into place, restoring the familiar boundaries. And yet something about them lingers, like the memory of brighter colours after removing sunglasses indoors. Rather than seeing these experiences as glitches or errors, It can be helpful to see them as brief glimpses of perception with fewer constraints, not a different reality, but the same reality experienced with slightly less compression. Another way to think about this is through sound. Imagine standing in a city street filled with countless overlapping noises: cars, voices, footsteps, wind, distant music. Your brain doesn't present all of this equally. Instead, it selects. You hear the voice speaking to you. The rest fades into a soft blur. Now imagine the selection loosening. The background grows clearer, layers you never noticed before begin to stand out. The street hasn't changed, only your attention has widened. In this sense, perception isn't about adding something new, it's about subtracting less. This idea helps explain why the brain works so hard to maintain the filter. Without it, everyday functioning would become difficult. You might struggle to focus on simple tasks. Time might feel distorted. Boundaries between self and world could blur. And yet, many of the experiences we associate with peace, insight, or transcendence seem to involve exactly this kind of loosening. The sense of effort fades, awareness expands, the usual urgency of thought slows down. From this perspective, the filter is not an enemy, it's a tool, a necessary one for navigating physical life. But tools are not the same as truth. If consciousness were limited entirely to the brain, then loosening the filter should make experience weaker, dimmer, or more chaotic. And sometimes it does, but often people report the opposite: more clarity, more meaning. A sense of being more fully present than usual. This creates a quiet tension in our understanding of the mind. Why would reducing brain control ever make experience feel richer? One possible answer is that the brain's role is not to generate awareness, but to narrow it, to focus a much broader field into a specific perspective suited for living in a body, moving through space, and interacting with others. In this view, the everyday sense of being you is not the full extent of consciousness. It's a focused point, like a spotlight illuminating a small area of a vast stage. The rest of the stage remains in darkness, not absent, just unseen. When the spotlight softens, more of the stage becomes visible, and if that is true, then the idea of an afterlife begins to look very different. It no longer feels like a distant destination reached only after death. Instead, it feels like the wider stage itself, the full space in which the spotlight has always been shining. Death, then, would not create this wider awareness. It would simply remove the need for the spotlight to stay narrow. This is not a claim. It's a way of arranging familiar observations into a different pattern. A pattern that treats everyday consciousness as one mode among many, rather than the final authority on what exists. You don't have to adopt this pattern. You can simply notice how often your experience already shifts between modes: focused and diffuse, narrow and wide, restless and spacious. As you listen now, you might notice that your awareness isn't fixed. Sometimes you're with the words, sometimes you drift. Sometimes the room feels close. Sometimes it fades away. These gentle changes are happening all the time without effort. The filter adjusts constantly, and perhaps, just perhaps, the moments when it relaxes are not mistakes, but reminders. Quiet hints that the reality you move through each day is only one version of what is available to awareness. For now, let that thought rest. There's no need to hold on to it tightly. Like sunglasses placed on a table nearby, it can simply remain within reach. If the idea of a perceptual filter feels a little more familiar now, it may help to look at it from another angle, one that quietly shapes almost every moment of modern life without us thinking about it at all. Consider the device you might be listening on right now: a phone, a tablet, a computer. When you tap the screen, icons respond, messages appear. images move. It feels direct and immediate, as though you are touching the thing itself. But you're not. You're interacting with a carefully designed interface. Beneath the surface, layers of complexity are hidden away, translated into symbols that are easy to understand and quick to use. You don't see the electrical currents. You don't watch the tiny switches turning on and off. You don't experience the deep structure of the machine. And you don't need to. The interface does its job by simplifying reality into something workable. Perception appears to work in much the same way. What you experience as solid objects, continuous time, and a stable sense of self may be less like raw reality and more like icons on a screen. Useful, intuitive, and reliable enough for daily life, but not a complete representation of what's actually there. Think about a simple example. Gravity shapes everything you do. It keeps your feet on the ground, your body balanced, your movements predictable, and yet you never see gravity itself. You don't feel its equations or its curves in space. You experience its effect through a simplified display. Weight, pressure, effort. The same is true for countless aspects of reality. Radio waves pass through your body every second, carrying music, voices, and data. You don't hear them unless a device translates them into sound. The waves exist whether you notice them or not. Light beyond the visible range fills the room you're in right now. Infrared, ultraviolet, and more. Your eyes simply aren't designed to show it to you. Not because it's unimportant, but because it isn't necessary for finding food, avoiding danger, or forming social bonds. In this sense, the world you experience is not false, it's selective. This distinction matters. A user interface is not a lie, it's a tool. It allows interaction without overwhelming the user with unnecessary detail. But if you mistake the interface for the entire system, you may draw conclusions that don't quite hold up. For example, if all you ever see are icons, you might assume icons are all that exist. If the icons disappear, you might assume the system has shut down entirely. This is where the idea of an afterlife often gets tangled. If consciousness is treated as an icon generated by the brain, then when the brain stops, consciousness must vanish as well. End of story. But if consciousness is more like the underlying system and the brain is more like the interface, then the disappearance of the display doesn't necessarily mean the system itself is gone. It may simply mean the interface is no longer doing its job. This doesn't require believing that consciousness floats away to some distant realm. It only requires considering that what you experience as you may be a formatted version of something broader, something that has been narrowed, shaped, and presented in a way that makes life in a body possible. Notice how this idea quietly explains certain everyday experiences without needing anything exotic. When you're deeply focused on a task, time seems to shrink. Hours pass unnoticed. When you're bored or anxious, time stretches and drags. The clock hasn't changed. Only the interface has adjusted how time is displayed. When you dream, entire worlds appear without physical space. You move, speak, and feel without muscles or sound waves. The interface switches modes, and reality reorganizes itself accordingly. When you meditate or become absorbed in music, the sense of being a separate observer sometimes fades. For a moment, experience feels unified, less divided into me and everything else. The interface loosens its usual boundaries. None of this requires leaving the body or entering another dimension. It simply involves changes in how experience is presented. From this perspective, the afterlife begins to look less like a dramatic transition and more like a change in display settings. The icons of time, space, and identity may rearrange or dissolve, revealing a broader field that was always operating beneath them. It's worth noting how gentle this interpretation is. It doesn't demand belief in specific images of heaven or fear of judgment. It doesn't require rejecting science or embracing mysticism. It simply invites a different relationship with what you already experience. You can still pay bills, wash dishes, and make plans for tomorrow. The interface continues to work. Life remains practical and grounded, but beneath it, there's a quiet suggestion that what you see is not the full resolution, and that suggestion has an interesting effect on fear. Much of our anxiety around death comes from imagining total shutdown, a black screen, an abrupt end to experience. But if experience is more like a system than a single display, then the end of one interface may not be as final as it seems. Again, this is not a claim. It's a way of arranging familiar facts into a new picture. A picture that reduces urgency rather than increasing it. That softens the edges of the unknown instead of sharpening them. As you listen, you may notice that awareness itself feels strangely independent of content. Thoughts come and go. Sensations rise and fall. Images appear and dissolve. And yet, something remains present throughout. Something that notices all of it without effort. That noticing doesn't seem to age. It doesn't feel rushed. It doesn't appear to be made of words or images. It's simply there, steady and quiet. If there is an afterlife worth considering, it may be closer to that noticing than to any place or story. Not somewhere you go, but something you relax back into when the interface no longer needs to stay so tight. For now, you don't need to draw conclusions. You can simply rest with the idea that the world you see may be a beautifully designed surface, not the whole depth beneath it. And sometimes, especially as the day fades and the mind grows quieter, that surface becomes just a little more transparent. As the idea of perception as an interface settles quietly in the background, it becomes natural to ask a simple question. If this way of understanding consciousness is even partly true, why has it taken so long to appear in mainstream science? Why does it still feel unusual, even unsettling, to suggest that awareness might extend beyond the brain? The answer is not hidden in secrecy or suppression. It lies in inheritance. Not genetic inheritance, but conceptual inheritance. The quiet passing down of assumptions from one generation of thinkers to the next, until those assumptions feel invisible, like the air in the room. Several centuries ago, Western thought adopted a very particular way of dividing reality. The world was separated into two parts. On one side, there was matter, solid, measurable, predictable. On the other side, there was mind, private, subjective, difficult to quantify. Once this line was drawn, it shaped everything that followed. Matter became the proper subject of science. Mind became something to explain away, reduce, or eventually fold back into matter. Consciousness, under this framework, was treated as something that must be produced by the brain in the same way heat is produced by fire or sound by vibration. This assumption did not arise from malice or ignorance. It arose from success. The material sciences flourished. Machines were built. Medicines were developed. The physical world became more predictable and controllable, and with each success the assumption hardened. If matter explained so much, surely it must explain everything. Consciousness, then, was placed inside the skull. Not because it was proven to belong there, but because there seemed to be nowhere else to put it. Over time, this placement became so familiar that it stopped being questioned. Research questions were formed around it. Experiments were designed to fit it. Funding flowed toward projects that reinforced it. And slowly, quietly, an entire culture of inquiry formed around the idea that awareness is something the brain manufactures. Once an assumption becomes this deeply embedded, it stops looking like an assumption at all. It looks like common sense, and this is where something subtle happens. When a framework becomes dominant, it doesn't just answer questions. It decides which questions are allowed to be asked. Under this inherited model, it makes sense to ask how memory is stored in neural circuits, or how attention shifts between brain networks. These are valuable questions, and they have yielded important insights. But other questions begin to sound strange, even improper. Questions like, what if the brain limits consciousness rather than creates it? Or what if awareness is not contained, but focused? Or what if the brain is more like a valve than a generator? These questions are not easily dismissed because they are foolish. They are dismissed because they don't fit the inherited map. Imagine trying to describe the ocean to someone who has only ever seen water inside a glass. If you tell them that the glass does not create the water, but merely holds a small portion of it, the idea might sound poetic, but unnecessary. Why look beyond the glass when the glass already explains what you see? This is how deeply embedded assumptions work. They are efficient, they reduce uncertainty, and they discourage curiosity in directions that might complicate the picture. It's important to notice that this is not unique to science. Every system that values stability develops filters. Languages develop grammar, societies develop norms, minds develop habits. These structures are not enemies of understanding. They are tools that make coordination possible, but tools also limit. When Western science inherited the split between mind and matter, it gained clarity in one direction and lost sensitivity in another. Consciousness became something to be located, dissected, and explained in parts, and anything that did not submit easily to measurement was treated as noise. This helps explain why experiences that fall outside the expected pattern are often reduced to side effects or errors. Vivid dreams become neural byproducts. Intuition becomes unconscious inference. Near-death experiences become hallucinations caused by stress. These explanations may contain elements of truth, but when they are applied automatically without curiosity, they can become ways of not seeing. Contrast this with cultures that did not begin with such a sharp division. In some traditions, awareness is not something that emerges late in the story of the universe. It is there from the beginning, woven into the fabric of existence. Matter is not dead substance waiting to be animated. It is one expression of something already awake. From that starting point, different questions arise. Not where does consciousness come from, but how does it take shape? Not why does awareness appear, but why does it feel so limited? These questions are not more mystical. They are simply oriented differently. When you change the question, you change what you notice. And when you change what you notice, entire patterns that were previously invisible begin to emerge. This does not mean that one worldview is right and the other is wrong. It means that each highlights certain aspects of reality while obscuring others. The problem arises only when one framework forgets that it is a framework at all. As you listen, you might notice how easily the mind reaches for familiar explanations, how comforting it feels to settle uncertainty quickly. This is the same impulse that shapes scientific history, the desire for stable ground. But there is another impulse as well, a quieter one, the impulse to sit with questions that do not resolve immediately, to allow uncertainty without rushing to fill it. Tonight's exploration belongs to that quieter impulse. If consciousness is not fully explained by the brain, then the boundary between life and afterlife may not be as sharp as we've been taught. It may be more like a gradient, a gradual shift in how experience is filtered and displayed. This possibility does not require rejecting science. It requires expanding it, allowing room for questions that feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, without dismissing them outright. As the day fades and the mind grows less busy, it becomes easier to sense how much of experience happens without effort. Awareness remains present whether thoughts are loud or quiet, whether the body is moving or still. This simple noticing does not argue. It does not insist, it waits. And sometimes, when we stop trying to force explanations, inherited assumptions loosen their grip. Not all at once, but gently, like glasses sliding down the nose, reminding us they were there all along. If inherited assumptions quietly guided the questions science learned to ask, then it follows that a small change in questioning could open an entirely different landscape, not a dramatic revolution, but a gentle turn of attention. The kind that doesn't reject what came before, but simply looks from another angle. For a long time, the dominant question surrounding consciousness has been fairly consistent. How does the brain produce awareness? What circuits generate thought? Where exactly does experience arise inside the head? These questions feel natural because they match the assumption that consciousness must be built from physical parts, assembled piece by piece like a machine. And yet, there is another question that is far less common but quietly powerful. What if the brain does not produce consciousness, but limits it? This question sounds subtle, almost semantic, but its implications are profound. It suggests that awareness might exist in a broader form, and that the brain's role is to narrow, focus, and constrain it into something practical for life in a body, like a lens that brings a vast, unfocused light into a sharp point. To see why this matters, imagine standing beneath a clear night sky. Countless stars are visible, stretching far beyond the horizon. Now imagine looking at that same sky through a narrow tube. The stars don't vanish. They're simply no longer in view. The tube hasn't created darkness, it has created focus. If consciousness were more like the sky than the tube, then asking how the tube creates stars would be the wrong question. The more relevant question would be how the tube selects which stars appear. This shift in questioning changes how many familiar experiences are understood. Instead of treating moments of expanded awareness as anomalies, they begin to look like moments when the selection process loosens, when the tube widens slightly and more of the sky becomes visible. From this perspective, things like deep meditation, vivid dreams, or near-death experiences don't require exotic explanations. They simply involve changes in how tightly awareness is being focused. The content of experience changes, but the underlying presence of awareness remains. This way of thinking also helps explain why consciousness often feels continuous, even as its contents change dramatically. Thoughts come and go, emotions rise and fall, sensations appear and disappear, yet something remains constant through all of it. The simple fact of being aware. That continuity is difficult to account for if consciousness is entirely constructed, moment by neural activity. It becomes easier to understand if the brain is shaping a pre-existing field of awareness into a specific pattern. None of this diminishes the importance of the brain. On the contrary, it highlights its remarkable role. The brain becomes not a mere generator, but a finely tuned instrument, a system capable of carving a stable identity out of a vast and fluid background. Think of how difficult it would be to function without that carving. If every memory, sensation, and possibility arrived at once, decision-making would grind to a halt. Action would become impossible. The narrowing of awareness is not a mistake. It is a necessity. And yet, necessities can still obscure. When science focuses only on how the brain produces consciousness, it naturally gravitates toward measurable correlates. Electrical patterns, chemical signals, networks lighting up in scans. These observations are real and valuable. They reveal how the interface operates, but they do not necessarily tell us what awareness itself is. It's a bit like studying the behavior of a television set. You can measure voltage changes, screen brightness, and speaker vibrations. You can even predict what will happen when certain components fail. But none of this explains where the program originates. The content on the screen is not generated by the television, even though the television is essential for displaying it. Again, this is not a claim about what consciousness must be. It is a reminder that the way a question is framed determines what kinds of answers are possible. When the brain is assumed to be the sole source of awareness, experiences that don't fit neatly into that model are treated as errors, hallucinations, malfunctions, side effects of stress or chemistry. Sometimes these labels are appropriate, sometimes they may be incomplete. When the brain is seen as a focusing mechanism, those same experiences become informative, not because they reveal another world, but because they reveal variations in how the interface works. This difference in framing also softens the boundary between life and death. If consciousness depends entirely on brain activity, then the cessation of that activity must mean the end of experience. Full stop. But if the brain shapes rather than creates awareness, then the end of biological function may represent a change in how awareness is expressed, not its disappearance. This idea can feel unsettling at first, especially if you're used to thinking of identity as something firmly anchored to the body. But it can also be strangely calming. It replaces the image of abrupt extinction with one of transition, not to somewhere else, but into a different mode of being. As you listen now, notice how awareness itself doesn't strain, it doesn't effort, it simply notices. Whether the mind is busy or quiet, whether thoughts are sharp or drifting, awareness remains steady in the background. That steadiness is easy to overlook precisely because it is always present. Like the hum of electricity in the walls, it fades from attention unless something interrupts it. Perhaps the most radical implication of asking different questions is not what it reveals about the afterlife, but what it reveals about life. If awareness is broader than the roles it plays, then identity becomes more flexible, less brittle, less tied to performance, memory, or achievement. You're not only the thoughts you think or the story you tell about yourself. You're also the quiet presence that remains when those stories pause. This understanding does not ask you to abandon science or reason. It asks you to notice the space in which reason itself appears, to recognize that the act of questioning is already happening within awareness, not outside it. As the night deepens and the edges of attention soften, it may become easier to feel this directly. Not as an idea to analyze, but as a simple fact of experience. Awareness is here, it has always been here, and the way we choose to question it shapes what we're able to see. By now, the idea that questions shape answers may feel a little more familiar, not because you've been persuaded of anything, but because you've likely noticed it in your own experience. The way a question is asked quietly guides where attention goes, and where it does not. This is especially true when we look at how different cultures have approached the mystery of consciousness. In many Western traditions, awareness is treated as something private and contained. It belongs to the individual. It begins at birth, ends at death, and lives somewhere behind the eyes. From this starting point, the task of science becomes locating it, measuring it, and eventually explaining how it is produced. But this is not the only way humans have framed the problem. In Japan, long before modern laboratories and brain scans, consciousness was not treated as an isolated event happening inside one organism. It was understood as something that permeates the world, not in a vague or sentimental sense, but as a practical assumption about how reality behaves. This perspective did not arise from abstract philosophy alone. It grew from everyday life, from paying attention to seasons, to landscapes, to the subtle rhythms of nature. Awareness was not something added to the world. It was already there, expressing itself through forms. In Shinto, the indigenous spiritual tradition of Japan, This idea appears in the concept of living presence within all things. Mountains, rivers, trees, tools, and homes are not seen as inert matter waiting to be animated. They're treated as participants in a shared field of existence, not because they think in human ways, but because they belong to the same underlying reality. When Buddhism later arrived in Japan, it did not replace this view, it deepened it. Buddhist teachings brought careful maps of experience, descriptions of how awareness moves, changes, and continues beyond the familiar boundaries of a single lifetime. But these descriptions were not meant to be accepted blindly. They were treated as observations to be tested through direct experience. Meditation, in this context, was not about belief, it was about investigation. A way of exploring consciousness from the inside with the same patience and precision that science brings to the outside world. This cultural background quietly shaped the kinds of questions Japanese researchers were willing to ask centuries later. Instead of beginning with the assumption that consciousness must be produced by the brain, some began with a different curiosity. What if awareness exists independently and the brain acts as a focusing point? What if life does not create consciousness but concentrates it? This is not a mystical leap. It is a shift in perspective. Imagine two people watching the same ocean. One asks how waves are generated by wind patterns and pressure differences. The other asks what the water itself is like when the surface becomes still. Both questions are valid, but they lead to different kinds of understanding. In cultures where consciousness is assumed to be everywhere, the disappearance of awareness at death is not taken for granted. Continuity becomes an open question rather than an impossibility, and open questions invite exploration. This helps explain why certain lines of research emerged in Japan that felt unusual or uncomfortable elsewhere. Not because Japanese scientists were less rigorous, but because they were less constrained by a single inherited model. They did not see the investigation of post-death consciousness as unscientific by default. They saw it as incomplete to assume an ending without looking carefully for continuity. At the same time, it's important to keep this grounded. Cultural perspectives do not replace evidence. They guide curiosity. They influence which hypotheses feel reasonable enough to test, and this is where something subtle but important happens. When a culture treats consciousness as fundamental, experiences that suggest continuity are not immediately dismissed as errors. They're approached as data points, not proof of an afterlife, but information about how awareness behaves under different conditions. This attitude does not demand belief in spirits or invisible worlds, it simply keeps the door open a little longer before closing it. As you listen now, notice how gentle this openness feels compared to rigid certainty. There is less urgency to explain everything immediately, more patience with ambiguity, a willingness to sit with not knowing. This patience is not passive, it is attentive. It listens closely to experience without forcing it into predefined categories. Perhaps this is why ideas about consciousness flowing beyond individual life have persisted so quietly in Japanese thought. Not as dramatic proclamations, but as background assumptions woven into daily rituals, art, and attention to nature. When you bow before entering a space, when you care for an object with respect, when you notice the changing light across a room, you are acknowledging that meaning is not confined to your own thoughts. It arises in relationship. This relational view of consciousness makes the idea of an afterlife feel less like a departure and more like a change in emphasis. Less about leaving the world and more about returning to a wider field that was never truly absent. Again, you don't need to accept this framing. You can simply notice how it shifts the emotional tone of the question. Death becomes less of a cliff and more of a horizon, something that marks a change in perspective rather than an absolute end. As the mind grows quieter, such shifts in framing can be felt more easily. You may notice that awareness does not feel tightly bound to your name, your memories, or your plans for tomorrow. Those are part of the interface, useful, meaningful, but not exhaustive. Beneath them, there is a sense of being that feels simpler, less defined, more spacious. Different cultures have given this simplicity different names or no names at all. What matters is not the label, but the experience itself. Tonight, we're not trying to decide which culture was right. We're noticing how changing the lens changes what becomes visible, and how the question of the afterlife may depend less on what we believe and more on how we've been taught to look. Let that thought rest gently, like a different way of seeing a familiar landscape. The landscape hasn't changed, only the angle from which it's viewed. As the idea of cultural lenses settles into place, another quiet question naturally emerges. If some traditions have treated consciousness as something broader and more continuous, what happens when that way of seeing meets modern scientific measurement? Can inner experience and laboratory instruments ever speak the same language? For a long time, these two worlds were kept carefully apart. Meditation belonged to personal practice. Measurement belonged to objective science. One was considered subjective and unreliable, the other precise and trustworthy. And yet, this division mirrors the same split we've already encountered between mind and matter. What if the separation itself is part of the limitation? In Japan, a small but intriguing line of inquiry emerged from researchers who are fluent in both worlds. Scientists who did not see meditation as a belief system, but as a disciplined way of observing consciousness from the inside. For them, inner states were not mystical secrets. They were phenomena that could be approached with patience, repetition, and care. One such researcher was Hiroshi Motoyama. He was trained in psychology and religious studies, but he was also deeply experienced in yoga and meditation. Rather than treating these practices as separate from science, he treated them as complementary perspectives on the same mystery. Motoyama noticed something curious. Practitioners of deep meditation often reported sensations that did not fit neatly into the usual map of the nervous system. Feelings of flow, expansion, warmth, or subtle movement that seemed to follow specific pathways in the body. These descriptions appeared consistently across cultures and centuries. Rather than dismissing these reports as imagination, Motoyama asked a different kind of question. If people are describing similar internal patterns again and again, could there be measurable correlates that science simply hasn't learned to look for yet? This question led to the development of devices designed not to prove spiritual ideas, but to detect subtle patterns around the human body. Instruments sensitive to minute electrical or electromagnetic changes, far gentler than the dramatic measurements used in hospitals or industrial labs. The idea was simple, even humble. If consciousness interacts with the body in ways we don't yet understand, perhaps those interactions leave faint traces, not dramatic signals, but quiet variations, slight shifts in conductivity, small changes in electrical balance. Motoyama's work focused on areas traditionally described in Eastern practices as channels or centers of experience. These were not treated as mystical objects, but as locations where practitioners consistently reported changes in sensation during altered states of awareness. When measurements were taken, something unexpected appeared. Patterns emerged that differed from person to person, but remained stable within the same individual. Even more intriguing, these patterns persisted during deep unconscious states, such as anesthesia or profound meditation. This raised an interesting possibility. If certain energetic or electrical signatures remain present when ordinary awareness fades, then consciousness may not be as tightly bound to surface brain activity as previously assumed. Something seems to remain organized, even when the usual markers of waking thought are quiet. Motoyama described this not as proof of an afterlife, but as evidence of a different model of consciousness. One that behaves more like a field than a product, more like a broadcast than a machine output. In this model, the body is not the source of awareness, but a point of interaction, a place where broader patterns intersect with physical form. The brain then becomes a sophisticated interface, translating subtle activity into thoughts, emotions, and perception. From this perspective, death does not look like annihilation. It looks like a change in configuration. The interface stops functioning, but the broader pattern may continue, no longer constrained by the same biological limits. Motoyama sometimes used the language of tuning to describe this process. Consciousness, in his view, does not switch off. It shifts. Like a radio changing stations, the content and clarity of experience change, but the underlying signal remains. It's important to pause here and breathe gently. These ideas are easy to misunderstand if taken too literally. This is not about invisible forces floating away from the body. It's about recognizing that the relationship between awareness and biology may be more flexible than we once thought. Think again of sleep. Every night the brain changes its mode of operation. Consciousness does not disappear. It reorganizes. Dreams arise. Identity loosens. Time behaves strangely. Yet something continues to experience. Deep anesthesia provides another example. From the outside, awareness appears absent, but from the inside, people often report sudden returns of experience, as if no time passed at all. This suggests that continuity may not require continuous memory or conscious thought. Motoyama's work does not settle these questions. It simply reopens them. It invites science to consider that consciousness may leave traces beyond the neural firing patterns we currently measure, and that these traces may persist even when the familiar interface dims. As you listen now, notice how your own awareness feels. It doesn't strain, it doesn't flicker on and off. It remains present whether thoughts are sharp or vague, whether attention is focused or drifting. That presence feels more like a field than a machine, more like space than a thing. Perhaps the most important contribution of this line of research is not what it proves, but what it allows. A conversation between inner experience and outer measurement. A reminder that the study of consciousness may require more than one kind of instrument. Tonight you don't need to decide what to believe. You can simply notice how the idea of consciousness as a field softens the edges of the question of death. It replaces the image of sudden disappearance with one of transition, a gentle retuning rather than a hard stop. Let that image settle naturally, like the slow adjustment of a dial in a quiet room. The signal doesn't rush, it doesn't resist, it simply finds a different place to rest. As the idea of consciousness behaving like a field gently settles in, another question naturally drifts into view. If awareness is not confined to the brain, if it can interact with the body as a broader pattern rather than a localized source, then how far does that interaction extend? Does consciousness only shape inner experience, or can it leave traces in the physical world beyond the body itself? This question makes many people uneasy, not because it is dangerous, but because it challenges a comforting boundary. The boundary that says influence requires touch, proximity, or force, that effects must follow simple lines from cause to effect, nearby and predictable. And yet modern physics has already taught us that distance is not always what it seems. Invisible forces shape matter across space. Signals pass through walls. Information travels without anything solid moving from point to point. Against this backdrop, a set of experiments carried out by Japanese researcher Masaru Emoto attracted widespread attention, curiosity and controversy. Not because they offered final answers, but because they asked a question many scientists were not prepared to sit with for long. What happens when water is exposed to human intention? The experiments themselves were simple in structure. Samples of water were exposed to words, music, images, or emotional expressions. Some were associated with gratitude, kindness, or harmony, others with anger, harsh language, or discord. After exposure, the water was frozen rapidly, and the resulting crystal formations were photographed. What Emoto reported was a consistent visual difference. Water exposed to gentle, coherent expressions appeared to form more symmetrical, balanced crystal patterns. Water associated with harsh or chaotic expressions appeared fragmented and irregular. To some, this was immediately dismissed as subjective interpretation. To others, it felt like a visual metaphor made physical, and to many, it raised an uncomfortable possibility. That consciousness, even when expressed as intention or attention, might influence matter in subtle ways. It's important to move carefully here. These experiments have been criticised for lacking strict controls, and they do not meet the standards required for definitive scientific proof. They should not be treated as settled facts, but they also should not be dismissed as meaningless without reflection. The value of Emoto's work lies not in certainty, but in provocation. It invites us to ask why the idea itself feels so threatening. Water, after all, is not exotic. It makes up most of your body. It carries signals, nutrients, and waste. It responds to temperature, pressure, and environment. If consciousness interacts with matter at all, water would be a likely medium. Emoto extended his inquiry further, exploring whether intention could have an effect even when applied at a distance. In these cases, water samples were isolated physically, while people focused attention or intention toward them remotely. The suggestion was not that energy beams were being sent across space, but that consciousness might not operate according to simple spatial rules, that the notion of here and there may belong more to the interface of perception than to awareness itself. Again, this is not proof. It is a challenge to assumptions. Modern science already accepts that certain relationships do not behave in straightforward ways. Correlations can appear without obvious causal chains. Systems can remain linked even when separated. Reality, at its deeper levels, often resists common sense intuition. So when people hear about intention affecting water, the discomfort may not come from impossibility, but from implication. If awareness can influence matter without direct contact, then consciousness is not merely a passenger in the universe, it is a participant, and participation implies responsibility. This may be one reason such ideas are met with skepticism, even hostility. They complicate the story. They blur the clean line between observer and observed. They suggest that inner states are not entirely private, sealed off from the world. Yet even without experiments, everyday experience hints at this connection. Think of how tone of voice changes the atmosphere in a room, how calm presence can settle tension, how stress seems to ripple outward, affecting interactions without a word being spoken. These are not supernatural effects. They are relational ones. They arise from systems interacting, often beneath conscious awareness. Emoto's work, at its most generous interpretation, can be seen as a visual metaphor for this relational reality, not as a claim that words magically rearrange molecules, but as a suggestion that coherence and chaos may have measurable signatures even in simple substances. From the perspective we've been exploring, this makes sense. If consciousness is a field, and matter is one of its expressions, then influence need not be dramatic to be real. It can be subtle, statistical, pattern-based. The afterlife in this light is not a realm where influence ends. It is a continuation of participation, possibly with fewer constraints. If awareness is already interwoven with the world, then death would not sever that connection. It would simply remove the biological interface through which it was focused. As you listen now, notice how your own state of mind subtly shapes your body. Tension tightens muscles, calm softens them, breathing changes, heart rhythm shifts. These are immediate, intimate examples of consciousness affecting matter. Whether that influence extends further than the body remains an open question. But the question itself is no longer unreasonable. Perhaps the most important takeaway here is not about water or crystals, but about humility. The recognition that our current models of consciousness may be incomplete, that some phenomena sit at the edges of understanding, not because they are impossible, but because we have not yet learned how to ask about them carefully. As the night deepens, certainty becomes less important than curiosity. You don't need to decide what is true. You can simply notice how the idea of consciousness as participatory changes the emotional tone of existence. If awareness matters, even subtly, then how you attend to the world has weight, not in a moralistic sense, but in a relational one. Presence becomes part of reality's ongoing conversation with itself. Let that idea settle gently, like ripples spreading across still water. Not dramatic, not forceful, just quietly, naturally moving outward. As ideas about fields, participation, and subtle influence begin to settle, it becomes easier to look again at experiences that most people quietly carry with them, often without knowing what to do with them. Experiences that don't announce themselves as extraordinary, yet feel slightly out of place within a strictly mechanical picture of the mind. Moments when the world seems to know something before you do, a sudden feeling that someone is about to call just before the phone rings, a sense of being watched, followed by the realization that someone is indeed looking your way. A vivid dream that seems to arrive with unusual clarity, lingering long after waking, or a powerful intuition that appears fully formed without any obvious chain of reasoning. In everyday life, these moments are usually brushed aside. Coincidence, imagination, pattern seeking. And sometimes those explanations are perfectly reasonable. The mind is good at finding meaning where none exists. But what if not all of these experiences are errors? What if some of them occur when the perceptual filter we've been discussing thins slightly? When awareness becomes less tightly focused, allowing information to arrive from a wider range than usual. This idea doesn't require believing that thoughts are magical signals or that the mind has special powers. It only requires accepting that consciousness may have modes, different settings, much like a camera adjusting aperture and exposure. Most of the time, the aperture is narrow, focus is sharp. The world is divided neatly into objects, timelines, and identities. This is ideal for survival and action. But occasionally, the aperture widens. In these moments, experience feels different. Time may seem less linear. Connections appear more meaningful. Boundaries soften. The mind becomes receptive rather than directive. Near-death experiences are often described in this way. People report a sense of expanded awareness, instant understanding, and an absence of fear. Time feels irrelevant. Identity feels larger, less personal, yet deeply familiar. Rather than treating these reports as fantasies or neurological malfunctions, we can view them as extreme examples of a more general process. The biological filter is loosened dramatically, either through trauma, lack of oxygen, or intense physiological stress. The interface destabilizes, and awareness shifts into a different mode. Importantly, many people describe these experiences as more real than real. This phrase appears again and again across cultures and belief systems. It's a curious choice of words. Hallucinations are usually described as confusing or dreamlike. These experiences are often described as vivid, coherent, and deeply meaningful. This doesn't prove anything on its own, but it raises a question worth holding gently. Why would reduced brain control produce an experience that feels clearer, rather than more chaotic? The same question applies, in smaller ways, to dreams. During sleep, the brain's usual organising structures relax. Sensory input is reduced, the body's largely disconnected from movement, and yet rich experiences continue. Stories unfold, emotions arise, awareness remains present. In some dreams, identity is flexible. You may shift perspective. You may experience events without a fixed sense of self, and when you wake, there is often a strange sense that the dream existed in a space not bound by physical location. Again, this does not require mystical interpretation. It simply suggests that awareness does not depend entirely on waking sensory input to function. Déjà vu offer another gentle example. The sudden feeling that a moment has already occurred, the sense of familiarity without memory. Neuroscience offers explanations involving timing mismatches in perception. These explanations may be accurate, but they don't exhaust the experience. What matters is how natural the experience feels when it happens. Not alarming, not disorienting, just oddly familiar, as if two perspectives briefly overlapped. Synchronicities work in a similar way. Meaningful coincidences that feel connected, not because they violate physical laws, but because they appear to align inner and outer events in a way that feels purposeful. Carl Jung described synchronicity not as a force, but as a causal connection, a pattern of meaning rather than mechanism. From the perspective we're exploring, synchronicities may arise when awareness is less rigidly separated from its environment. When inner states and outer events are not experienced as entirely independent, the key point here is not to label these experiences as supernatural. It is to notice how they cluster around moments of reduced control, fatigue, stress, deep relaxation, absorption, transition states between waking and sleeping. These are precisely the moments when the brain's filtering role is altered. From this view, everyday signals are not messages sent from elsewhere. They are moments when the boundary between awareness and environment becomes more permeable, not permanently, not reliably, just enough to allow a different pattern of experience to emerge. This helps explain why these experiences cannot be summoned at will. They are not skills. They are side effects of loosened structure, and this also explains why trying too hard often makes them disappear. Effort tightens the filter, control narrows focus, the interface snaps back into its default mode. As you listen now, you may notice that your own awareness fluctuates naturally. Sometimes you're fully present with the words. Sometimes they drift into the background. Sometimes images arise without effort. Sometimes nothing happens at all. All of this is part of the same system adjusting itself. If consciousness was strictly confined to neural activity, these variations would be difficult to explain without invoking error. But if awareness is broader, and the brain's role is to shape it, then variability becomes expected. From this perspective, the afterlife is not a sudden awakening into something alien. It is a continuation of a process already familiar, though usually subtle, a further loosening of filters that occasionally relax even during life. Death, then, would represent not the first time awareness changes mode, but the most complete version of a shift that has already occurred many times in smaller ways. This framing does not demand belief. It invites recognition. The recognition that the mind you experience daily is not fixed. It is dynamic, adjustable, and deeply sensitive to context. As the night grows quieter, these shifts become easier to feel. The urgency of explanation fades. The need to categorize softens. You don't need to interpret every strange moment. You can simply allow them to exist as part of a wider range of human experience, not proofs, not delusions, just signals that the filter is not absolute. And perhaps, in that gentle uncertainty, something important becomes possible. A relationship with the unknown that is not driven by fear, but by curiosity and rest. Let that thought settle naturally. Like awareness itself, it doesn't need to go anywhere. It can simply remain quietly present. As the exploration continues, it may feel natural to pause and ask how science itself decides what belongs inside its boundaries. Not in terms of rules written down somewhere, but in terms of habits. Quiet agreements about what counts as real, what counts as speculative, and what is simply set aside for later. Science, at its heart, is not a list of conclusions. It is a method of curiosity, a way of asking careful questions and refining them over time. But like any human activity, it unfolds within limits. And one of those limits is measurement. If something can be measured reliably, it can be studied systematically. If it cannot, it tends to remain in the background, not necessarily denied, but rarely discussed. This has happened many times before in the history of knowledge. There was a time when bacteria were not part of medicine, not because they did not exist, but because there was no way to see them. Illness was explained through imbalances, vapours, or moral weakness. The idea that entire worlds of life could exist beyond human sight would have sounded unnecessary, even absurd. There was also a time when distant galaxies were not part of astronomy. The night sky was thought to end at the stars visible to the naked eye. Anything beyond that was philosophical speculation. The universe seemed small because our instruments were small. In both cases, reality did not change when new tools appeared, only our access to it did. This distinction matters deeply when we talk about consciousness. At present, science is extremely good at measuring certain aspects of the brain. Electrical activity, blood flow, chemical signalling. Patterns that correlate with attention, memory, and emotion. These measurements are valuable. They tell us how the interface behaves. But correlation is not identity. When we see that a certain pattern of brain activity accompanies a thought, it is tempting to conclude that the brain produced the thought in the same way a factory produces an object. But this is an interpretation, not an observation. What is directly observed is simultaneous change, not origin. Imagine watching a city at night from above. When people wake up, lights turn on. When they sleep, lights turn off. You could track these patterns precisely. But no matter how detailed your measurements become, the lights alone will never explain the inner experience of the people inside the buildings. The lights are part of the system. They are not the whole story. In the same way, measuring neural activity tells us a great deal about how experience is shaped and expressed. It does not automatically tell us where awareness itself comes from, or whether it exists only in the form we can currently detect. This is where the idea of subtle phenomena enters quietly. The word subtle does not mean mystical. It means difficult to detect with existing tools. Weak signals, complex patterns, effects that do not announce themselves loudly. Many physical phenomena were once subtle in this sense: magnetic fields, radiation, electrical currents. They shaped the world long before humans learned how to measure them. Their reality did not depend on our instruments, only our understanding did. When applied to consciousness, this perspective encourages patience rather than dismissal. It suggests that the absence of measurement may reflect the limits of tools, not the absence of the phenomenon itself. This does not mean that every reported experience should be taken at face value. Skepticism remains essential, but skepticism is not the same as refusal. It is a posture of careful attention, not a closing of the door. There is a quiet difference between saying this cannot exist and saying we do not yet know how to study this. One statement ends inquiry, the other keeps it alive. In fields that study the mind, this difference is especially important because the observer and the observed are not fully separate. Consciousness is both the thing being studied and the medium through which study occurs. This makes it uniquely challenging. Tools designed to measure external objects may not be sufficient for phenomena that involve inner experience, relational context, or dynamic states that change with observation itself. This does not make such phenomena unreal, it makes them difficult. Consider how emotion works. You can measure heart rate, hormone levels, and brain activity, but none of these measurements capture the feeling of sadness or joy as it is lived. They describe its correlates, not its essence. Consciousness may be similar, measurable in its effects, elusive in its core. From this angle, research at the edge of measurement becomes less threatening. It no longer looks like an attempt to smuggle belief into science. It looks like a natural extension of curiosity into areas where tools are still catching up. This framing also helps us understand why discussions of post-death consciousness provoke such strong reactions. If awareness is assumed to be fully accounted for by measurable brain activity, then anything that suggests continuity beyond that activity feels like a violation of scientific order. But if awareness is treated as something we're still learning how to approach, then continuity becomes a question rather than a contradiction. Questions are not enemies of science, they are its fuel. As you listen now, notice how comfortable it feels to allow uncertainty without anxiety. You're not being asked to replace one belief with another, you're simply being invited to notice how much of reality has always existed beyond the reach of immediate measurement. Even your own awareness cannot be fully measured. It cannot be weighed or photographed. And yet, it is the most immediate fact of your existence. Perhaps the mistake is not in exploring what we cannot yet measure, but in assuming that measurement defines reality itself. As the night deepens and the mind relaxes its grip on certainty, this perspective can feel surprisingly restful. You don't need to solve the mystery of consciousness to live within it. You only need to recognize that mystery is not a failure of understanding. It is a sign that understanding is still unfolding. Let that thought settle gently. Like a horizon that does not retreat when you approach it, but continues to invite curiosity without demanding arrival. As the idea of subtle phenomena settles into a more comfortable place, it becomes possible to talk about individuals who stood at the edge of measurement without falling into certainty. People who did not claim to have solved the mystery of consciousness, but who were willing to look where others hesitated. Hiroshi Motoyama was one such figure. He's often described in simple labels: scientist, psychologist, meditation practitioner, but those labels don't quite capture what made his work unusual. Motoyama did not see these roles as separate identities. He treated them as complementary ways of asking the same question from different sides. On one hand, he was trained in the careful discipline of research, hypotheses, controlled conditions, repeatability. On the other, he was deeply familiar with the inner landscapes described in meditation and yoga traditions. He didn't approach these inner states as beliefs to defend, but as experiences to observe. What interested Motoyama most was not proving ancient ideas right or wrong, but understanding why people across cultures reported similar internal sensations during deep states of awareness. Feelings of flow, warmth, pressure, or expansion that followed consistent patterns, regardless of language or background. Rather than assuming these sensations were meaningless, he asked a modest question. If people are describing similar inner experiences again and again, could there be subtle physical correlates that have simply gone unnoticed? This question led him to develop instruments designed to be sensitive rather than dramatic, devices that did not look for large signals or obvious effects, but for small variations that might accompany changes in awareness. The goal was not to capture consciousness itself, but to observe how the body behaves when consciousness shifts. One such instrument became known as the apparatus for meridian identification, often shortened to a simple name for convenience. Despite the technical label, the idea behind it was straightforward. The device measured extremely small electrical changes at specific points on the body, places traditionally associated with changes in sensation during meditation or focused attention. It's important to pause here and soften the language. This was not a machine that detected thoughts, emotions, or spiritual energy. It did not claim to measure the soul or the afterlife. It measured tiny electrical patterns at the surface of the body, patterns that changed under different conditions of awareness. What made the findings interesting was not their size, but their consistency. When measurements were taken over time, individuals showed relatively stable patterns, like a personal signature. When the state of awareness changed deeply, through meditation or altered consciousness, those patterns shifted. But they did not vanish. Even more intriguingly, similar patterns were observed during states where ordinary consciousness appeared absent, such as deep unconsciousness. This suggested that something organized remained, even when the usual markers of waking awareness were quiet. Motoyama was careful in how he described these results. He did not frame them as proof of anything beyond the body. He spoke instead of indications, hints that the relationship between awareness and physiology might be more layered than a simple on-off switch. In his writings, he often returned to the metaphor of tuning. Consciousness, in this view, does not disappear when the brain changes state. It shifts its mode of expression, like a melody played softly or loudly, or through different instruments. From this perspective, death becomes a question of transition rather than termination. Not because Motoyama claimed to have measured what happens after death, but because his work challenged the assumption that consciousness collapses entirely when familiar biological patterns stop. It's worth noting how carefully this line of inquiry was positioned. Motoyama did not demand that mainstream science accept his conclusions. He understood the limits of his tools and the cultural resistance to ideas that blur established boundaries. Instead, he framed his work as exploratory, a first step into territory that had not yet been mapped, an invitation to refine instruments, improve methods, and ask better questions. And this careful posture may be the most important part of his legacy. Research at the edges of acceptability often fails not because it is wrong, but because it is premature. Tools are crude. Language is imprecise. Cultural expectations are rigid. What begins as curiosity can easily be mistaken for overreach. Motoyama navigated this tension by refusing to sensationalize. He did not promise answers about the afterlife. He did not claim to reveal hidden worlds. He simply suggested that consciousness might leave traces beyond what we usually measure, and that those traces deserve careful study rather than dismissal. As you listen now, notice how different this approach feels from dramatic claims. There is no urgency, no demand for belief, only a willingness to sit with uncertainty and gather small pieces of information over time. This attitude aligns naturally with the theme we've been exploring, the idea that reality is not fully revealed all at once, that understanding unfolds gradually as tools and perspectives evolve. Motoyama's work reminds us that science is not threatened by humility, it is strengthened by it. The admission that we do not yet know how to measure something is not a failure, it is an honest description of where we are. And in the quiet space before sleep, that honesty feels reassuring. It releases the pressure to solve everything now. It allows the mystery of consciousness to remain open, without turning it into a source of fear. Perhaps the most meaningful aspect of Motoyama's attempt to measure the unseen is not what it found, but how it invites us to listen differently, to pay attention to patterns that are faint but persistent, to respect experiences without rushing to label them. As awareness drifts and the mind relaxes, these subtle patterns become easier to notice, not as answers but as gentle reminders that reality is richer than any single framework can capture. And in that richness, the question of the afterlife no longer feels like a distant problem to solve. It feels like part of a larger inquiry into what awareness is, how it moves, and how it continues to express itself in ways we are only beginning to understand. With the idea of subtle measurement still resting gently in the background, it becomes possible to approach one of the most delicate questions in this entire exploration. Not because it is dramatic, but because it touches something personal. The sense that inner states might matter beyond our private thoughts. The word intention often carries heavy baggage. It can sound mystical, wishful, or unscientific. It can evoke images of trying to bend reality through willpower alone. And because of that, many discussions shut down before they begin. But intention does not have to mean force. At its simplest, intention is direction, the way attention is organised, the pattern formed when awareness holds something steadily, rather than scattering itself across many things at once. You experience intention every day without labelling it as such. When you focus on a task, your body aligns around it. When you speak kindly, the atmosphere shifts. When you're anxious, even without words, others often feel it. These are not supernatural effects. They are patterns of organisation moving through systems. The question raised by certain controversial experiments is not whether intention can magically override physical laws, but whether coherent attention leaves subtle traces. Traces that may not be obvious, dramatic, or easy to isolate, but present nonetheless. One of the most widely discussed examples involves water. Water is simple, familiar, and everywhere. It flows through your body, your environment, and your daily life. It responds quickly to temperature, pressure, and structure. If any substance were sensitive to subtle changes, water would be a natural candidate. Experiments involving water and intention typically follow a gentle logic. Expose water to different conditions. Observe whether patterns differ. Do not assume meaning too quickly. Do not expect certainty. In some cases, water has been exposed to words, sounds, or emotional expressions. In others, attention or intention has been directed toward it without physical contact. Afterward, changes in structure or pattern have been examined. The results have sparked curiosity and criticism in equal measure. Critics point out issues of subjectivity, replication, and experimental control. These concerns are valid and necessary. Science depends on them. Without skepticism, inquiry collapses into storytelling. But curiosity persists because the question itself does not vanish. Why do people keep returning to this idea, even when it remains controversial? Perhaps because it resonates with lived experience. Most people can feel the difference between a tense environment and a calm one, between a room filled with anger and one filled with ease. These differences are not imagined, they are embodied. They affect breathing, posture, and nervous system responses. If intention is understood not as a mystical power, but as a pattern of coherence, then its influence becomes less mysterious. Coherent systems tend to organize other systems. Disorganized systems tend to disrupt them. This is true in physics, biology, and social dynamics. A steady rhythm can entrain movement. A calm presence can stabilize a group. A focused signal can cut through noise. Seen this way, intention is not about imposing will. It is about alignment. The discomfort many feel around these ideas may come from a fear of sliding into magical thinking. The fear that acknowledging subtle influence means abandoning rigour. But influence does not require omnipotence. It does not require control. It only requires interaction. Even in conventional science, interaction does not always behave linearly. Small inputs can produce large effects under the right conditions. Context matters, timing matters, organisation matters. The human mind is itself a complex system. When it enters a coherent state, whether through calm attention, compassion or focus, it behaves differently than when it is fragmented. That difference is not confined to inner experience. It shows up in physiology, behaviour and relationships. The experiments involving water can be seen as an attempt to visualise this difference, not to prove that intention commands matter, but to explore whether coherence leaves a signature. Whether those signatures are robust, replicable, or fully understood remains open. But the framing matters. When intention is described as a force, it invites disbelief. When it is described as organisation, it invites inquiry. This distinction also protects the exploration from becoming heavy or anxious. There is no demand that you control your thoughts perfectly, no suggestion that stray emotions cause harm. Life is far messier than that. Instead, the idea is gentler. Patterns of attention shape experience. Coherence tends to calm systems. Fragmentation tends to agitate them. From the perspective we've been building, this fits naturally. If consciousness is a field and matter is one of its expressions, then organisation within that field may influence how expressions take shape. Not deterministically, not predictably, but relationally. This also reframes the afterlife question once again. If awareness already participates in shaping experience through subtle organisation, then death does not end participation. It may simply remove one of the interfaces through which organisation was expressed. The broader pattern continues, even as the specific form changes. As you listen now, notice how your own state gently influences the body. When attention softens, muscles release. When worry arises, tension follows. These are immediate examples of intention as organisation, not command. There's nothing to master here, nothing to believe, only something to notice. Perhaps the most important contribution of these controversial ideas is not what they claim, but what they allow us to reconsider. That consciousness may not be a passive observer, that attention matters, that presence shapes experience in quiet, cumulative ways. As the night deepens, these ideas do not need to be analysed. They can simply rest alongside your own sensations, the rhythm of breathing, the weight of the body, the subtle feeling of being aware at all. If intention exists anywhere, it exists here, in the gentle direction of attention toward rest, toward ease, toward letting go of the need to resolve everything before sleep. And in that letting go, awareness organises itself naturally, without effort, without force, just as it always has. With the idea of subtle influence and organised awareness still present, we arrive naturally at a class of experiences that many people find both fascinating and difficult to place. Experiences reported across cultures, belief systems and historical periods, often by people who had no interest in philosophy or spirituality before they occurred. Near-death experiences. These moments tend to arise under extreme physiological stress, severe injury, cardiac arrest, trauma where the body's usual systems are pushed to their limits. From the outside, these moments appear chaotic, even catastrophic, and yet, from the inside, many people describe something very different. They speak of clarity. One of the most consistent features of near-death experiences is not confusion, but order. People report a sudden sense of understanding, as if knowledge arrived all at once rather than piece by piece. Questions that once felt complex seem irrelevant. The need to reason disappears, replaced by immediate knowing. Time, in particular, behaves strangely. Instead of flowing forward moment by moment, time is often described as collapsing into a single, all-encompassing presence. Past, present and future feel available at once, not as memories or predictions, but as a unified field of experience. Some describe reviewing their lives not as a sequence, but as a simultaneous whole. This collapse of time is difficult to express in language, because language itself is linear. Words arrive one after another. Sentences unfold in order. But the experience people describe does not unfold. It simply is. Importantly, this sense of timelessness is not described as disorienting. It is often described as natural, familiar, as though time, rather than being a fundamental structure, is a tool the mind normally uses, one that can be set aside when it is no longer needed. Another recurring feature is expanded identity. People frequently report that their sense of self no longer feels confined to their body. Boundaries soften. Identity becomes less personal and more inclusive. They may feel connected to others, to life as a whole, or to a presence that feels deeply intimate without being individual. This expansion is often accompanied by an absence of fear. Even in situations where the body is clearly in danger, fear is replaced by calm, acceptance, or even warmth. This is not because the experience is pleasant in a superficial sense, but because something more fundamental seems to take precedence. Perhaps the most striking description, repeated again and again, is that the experience feels more real than real. This phrase deserves careful attention. Hallucinations, dreams, and delirium are usually described as vague, fragmented, or unstable. Near-death experiences are often described as vivid, coherent, and internally consistent. People report that waking life afterward feels comparatively muted, as if the contrast has shifted. This does not mean that near-death experiences are literal glimpses of an afterlife, but it does suggest that reduced brain control does not necessarily lead to reduced clarity. From the perspective we've been developing, this makes sense. If the brain normally functions as a filter, narrowing awareness to support survival, then extreme physiological disruption may loosen that filter dramatically. The usual constraints fall away, the interface destabilizes, and awareness shifts into a different mode. This does not require invoking supernatural explanations. It only requires accepting that consciousness may not be identical to the brain processes that usually structure it. Time perception offers a useful analogy. In everyday life, time feels steady and linear. But this is not always the case. During accidents, intense focus, or moments of deep emotion, time often seems to slow down or speed up. These distortions are widely acknowledged and studied. Near-death experiences may represent the most extreme version of this phenomenon, not just a slowing or speeding of time, but a complete reorganization of how time is experienced. If time is part of the interface rather than a fundamental feature of awareness, then its collapse under extreme conditions becomes understandable. Awareness does not disappear, it reorganizes. Skeptical explanations often focus on chemical changes in the brain during trauma. These explanations may account for some aspects of the experience, but they struggle to explain why the resulting state is often reported as clearer, calmer, and more meaningful than ordinary consciousness. If the brain were simply failing, we might expect confusion, fragmentation, or loss of coherence. Instead, many reports emphasize integration and understanding. This does not mean every near-death experience is the same, they vary widely. Cultural expectations shape imagery. Personal beliefs influence interpretation. But beneath these variations, a common structure appears: expanded awareness, altered time, reduced fear, a sense of continuity. These features align closely with the idea that the perceptual filter has loosened, that awareness is no longer tightly bound to the biological tasks of the body. From this angle, near-death experiences are not messages from elsewhere. They are extreme examples of a process that occurs in milder forms throughout life, in dreams, in deep meditation, in moments of absorption where time and self momentarily dissolve. Death, then, is not the first time awareness encounters this mode. It is simply the most complete instance of it. This reframing has a gentle effect on the fear surrounding death. If awareness has already tasted non-linear time, expanded identity and calm presence, then death becomes less alien, less of a leap into the unknown. More of a continuation of something already familiar, though rarely sustained. As you listen now, you may notice that your own sense of time is already softening. Minutes feel less sharp. The future feels less urgent. Awareness rests more easily in the present moment. This softening is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. But it hints at how flexible experience already is. Near-death experiences simply reveal that flexibility at an extreme. You don't need to decide what these experiences mean. You can simply acknowledge their consistency, their coherence, and the way they challenge simple assumptions about consciousness ending abruptly with the body. In the quiet before sleep, such challenges do not need to be resolved. They can simply be held gently, like a question that does not demand an answer. If awareness can exist without time as we know it, even briefly, then the afterlife may not be a place waiting ahead. It may be a mode of experience that time itself cannot contain. And with that thought resting softly, we can allow the mind to relax further, knowing that whatever awareness is, it seems capable of far more than we usually ask of it. After considering near-death experiences, it may feel natural to turn towards something far more ordinary, something so common that it often passes without comment, yet strange enough to linger in memory when it occurs: déjà vu. Almost everyone has experienced it at least once. You enter a room, hear a sentence or witness a simple event, and suddenly a quiet certainty arises. This has happened before, not in a vague way, but with an unsettling clarity. The feeling arrives fully formed, then fades just as quickly, leaving behind a gentle confusion. Neuroscience offers explanations for déjà vu, and many of them are sensible. A slight timing mismatch between perception and memory, a momentary delay in how information is processed, the brain briefly tagging a present experience as familiar before correcting itself. These explanations are useful, but they don't fully capture the feeling itself. Déjà vu does not usually feel like a mistake. It does not feel like confusion or error. It feels precise, almost calm. There is rarely panic attached to it. More often there is curiosity, a quiet sense of recognition without a source. This emotional tone matters. If déjà vu were simply a malfunction, we might expect it to feel disorienting or distressing. Instead, it often carries a strange neutrality. The mind notices it, registers it, and then moves on. From the perspective we've been building, déjà vu can be seen as a brief loosening of the filter that organizes time into a strict sequence. Not a breakdown, but a momentary overlap. In everyday awareness, time feels like a line. One moment follows another. Past, present, and future remain distinct. This structure is essential for functioning. It allows planning, memory, and action. But this structure may be more flexible than it appears. In dreams, time already behaves differently. Events skip forward or backward without explanation. Scenes merge, duration becomes elastic. Yet the dream often feels coherent while it is happening. Déjà vu may be a waking life echo of this flexibility. Imagine time not as a line, but as a landscape. In normal awareness, you walk along a narrow path, seeing only what lies directly ahead. In a moment of déjà vu, it's as if the path briefly widens, allowing a glimpse of nearby terrain. The glimpse is fleeting. The path narrows again. But the sense of having seen more remains. This does not mean you're remembering the future or accessing hidden knowledge. It simply suggests that the brain's usual method of sequencing experience can momentarily slip, allowing awareness to register familiarity without memory. Some researchers describe déjà vu as a timing mismatch. Perception arrives a fraction of a second earlier or later than expected, creating the sensation of familiarity. This explanation fits well with the idea of an interface. The display briefly misaligns, not because reality has changed, but because the translation process has momentarily shifted. What's interesting is how quickly the system corrects itself. The feeling fades, linear time resumes, the interface reasserts its usual order. But the question remains, why does the feeling feel so meaningful while it lasts? Perhaps because it hints at something we rarely notice, that the sense of now is constructed, that the present moment is not a single point, but a small window assembled from overlapping processes. Philosophers sometimes refer to this as an extended present, not an instant, but a span, a short duration within which experience feels unified. Déjà vu may occur when this span briefly widens or overlaps with itself. In that overlap, the present feels oddly familiar, not because it happened before, but because awareness touches its own continuity. From this angle, déjà vu is not about memory at all, it is about recognition. Awareness recognizing itself, momentarily unanchored from the usual story of before and after. This interpretation aligns gently with the idea of an eternal now, not as a mystical claim, but as a description of how awareness behaves when not tightly bound to sequencing. In near-death experiences, this loosening is extreme. Time collapses entirely. In déjà vu, it is subtle, almost polite, a whisper rather than a shout, and because it is subtle, it is easy to dismiss. But small experiences often carry the most insight, precisely because they occur within ordinary life. They don't require crisis or trauma. They arrive unexpectedly, then leave without explanation. This is why déjà vu can be so strangely comforting. It does not threaten identity. It does not disrupt functioning. It simply introduces a brief sense that time is not quite as rigid as it seems. From the perspective of the afterlife question, déjà vu offers something important. It suggests that awareness is capable of existing in a mode where past and present are not strictly separated. That linear time is a tool rather than an absolute. If awareness can momentarily step outside that tool during life, then stepping outside it permanently may not be as alien as we imagine. Again, this does not mean that déjà vu proves anything about existence beyond death. It simply reveals flexibility, the same flexibility seen in dreams, meditation, and moments of deep absorption. As you listen now, you may notice how the present moment already feels layered. You're aware of the voice, the room, the body, and perhaps drifting thoughts, all at once. The sense of now contains many elements, not just one. This layered quality is usually invisible because it is so familiar. Déjà vu briefly draws attention to it by creating a mismatch that awareness notices, and then it passes, leaving behind a faint reminder. That time, as you experience it, is not something you are trapped inside. It is something your mind is actively constructing. In the quiet before sleep, this realization can feel gently liberating. There is less pressure to hold on to moments, less urgency to push forward. If the present moment is already wider than it appears, then rest becomes easier. Awareness does not need to chase time. It can simply remain where it is. Déjà vu may be brief, but its implication lingers softly. That awareness is not confined to a single point moving through time, but something more spacious, touching moments in ways we are only beginning to notice. Let that thought rest naturally. Like the feeling itself, it does not need to last. Its quiet presence is enough. As the exploration of time's flexibility gently fades into the background, another familiar experience comes into view, one that doesn't arrive with the strangeness of déjà vu, and doesn't require the extremity of near-death experiences. It appears quietly, often in the middle of ordinary life, and is usually gone before we think to examine it. A sudden knowing. You think of someone you haven't spoken to in years, and later that day they reach out. You feel an urge to take a different route home without knowing why, and later learn there was an accident along the usual path. You sense that a conversation is about to change tone moments before it does. These moments are easy to explain away. Coincidence, selective memory, the mind connecting dots after the fact. And often, those explanations are perfectly reasonable, but not always satisfying. What gives these experiences their weight is not their rarity, but their quality. They arrive without effort, without internal dialogue. There is no step-by-step reasoning you can point to. The knowing is simply there, complete and immediate. This is what people usually mean when they talk about intuition. Intuition is often misunderstood as guesswork or emotional reaction, but in many cases it behaves more like pattern recognition operating below conscious awareness. The mind integrates vast amounts of information, tone of voice, posture, context, memory, subtle changes in environment, faster than words can keep up. By the time conscious thought arrives, the conclusion is already formed. In this sense, intuition is not irrational. It is pre-rational. It works before language, not against it. Synchronicity adds another layer to this experience. The term was used to describe coincidences that feel meaningful without having an obvious cause and effect relationship. Not because they violate physical laws, but because they seem to align inner states with outer events in a way that feels personally significant. You're thinking deeply about a question, and an unexpected conversation brings exactly the perspective you needed. You feel uncertain about a decision, and a chance encounter reframes it entirely. Nothing supernatural appears to happen, and yet the timing feels precise. From a purely mechanical view of the universe, such moments are statistical noise. Given enough events, some will line up, and that explanation may be mathematically sound. But experience is not lived statistically. The meaning of a moment does not come from probability alone. It comes from context, from relevance, from how an event fits into the ongoing story of awareness. From the perspective we've been building, synchronicity may arise when the boundary between inner and outer experience feels thinner, not because the universe is arranging events on demand, but because awareness is more open to recognizing patterns that normally pass unnoticed. When attention is scattered, meaning is hard to see. When attention is coherent, patterns emerge. This does not mean that everything happens for a reason. That idea quickly becomes heavy and exhausting. It places pressure on every event to justify itself. Instead, synchronicity can be understood as occasional alignment. Brief moments when internal questions and external events resonate, like two notes briefly forming a chord. This framing avoids magical thinking while preserving the experience itself. It allows synchronicity to be meaningful without making it predictive or controllable. You cannot summon it. You cannot rely on it. It simply happens, then fades. And that impermanence is important. If synchronicity were constant, it would lose its significance. Its value lies in its rarity and subtlety. It does not shout, it whispers. Modern life trains us to ignore whispers. We are encouraged to trust what can be measured, repeated, and explained quickly. Anything that arrives without a clear chain of reasoning is treated with suspicion. Intuition is labelled unreliable. Coincidence is dismissed. This training serves a purpose. It protects against superstition and error. But it also narrows the range of experience we allow ourselves to acknowledge. From the perspective of consciousness as a filtered field, this narrowing makes sense. Focus requires exclusion. To act efficiently, the mind must ignore most signals. Only the most relevant information reaches awareness. Occasionally, however, something slips through. A pattern too coherent to ignore. A timing too precise to feel random. Not proof of anything beyond reality, but a reminder that reality is richer than our habitual categories. These moments often occur during transitions, periods of uncertainty. Emotional openness, fatigue, stillness, times when the usual mental noise quiets enough for subtler patterns to be noticed. This is why synchronicity and intuition are difficult to study directly. They do not behave like repeatable experiments. They depend on context, state of mind, and personal relevance. But difficulty of study does not equal non-existence. It simply places these experiences near the edge of measurement, where many meaningful aspects of human life already reside. From the afterlife perspective, these moments carry a gentle implication. If awareness can register meaning without linear causation, if knowing can arise without deliberate thought, then consciousness is not limited to the step-by-step logic we usually associate with it. It has modes that operate outside ordinary sequencing. This aligns with what people report in near-death experiences: instant understanding, knowledge without learning, recognition without memory. Seen this way, synchronicity and intuition are not anomalies. They are small, everyday expressions of a broader capacity. A capacity that becomes more pronounced when the perceptual filter loosens. Again, this does not mean that every feeling should be trusted blindly. Discernment remains essential. Intuition can be wrong. Patterns can be misread. Awareness is not infallible. But dismissing these experiences entirely may be just as limiting as overvaluing them. The balanced approach is gentle recognition, acknowledging that not all knowing arrives through words, that some understanding is felt rather than reasoned. That meaning sometimes appears without explanation. As you listen now, notice how your own mind already operates this way. You sense when it is time to rest. You feel when a thought is no longer helpful. You recognize when a conversation has reached its natural end. These are quiet forms of intuition, not dramatic, not mystical, just awareness doing its work efficiently. In the quiet before sleep, these subtle signals become easier to hear. The mind is less busy defending itself, less concerned with justification, more open to noticing. If consciousness continues beyond the body, it may do so in this same wordless way, not through dramatic signs, but through direct knowing, not as a sequence of events, but as immediate presence. Synchronicity and intuition offer small previews of that mode, not evidence to cling to, but experiences to acknowledge. They remind us that awareness is not only a thinker, it is also a listener, and sometimes, when the noise fades, what it hears feels quietly, unmistakably right. As the exploration of intuition and synchronicity settles, a deeper question begins to surface. not about consciousness itself, but about our relationship to it. Why does the idea that awareness might continue beyond the body feel so unsettling to many people, even when presented gently and without grand claims? The answer does not require hidden plots or shadowy controllers. It rests in something far simpler and far older: fear. Fear is not an enemy of life. It is one of its most effective tools. Long before language, belief systems, or institutions existed, fear shaped behaviour. It kept early humans alert to danger, cautious around the unknown, and responsive to threats. Without it, survival would have been unlikely. Over time, fear became more abstract. It moved beyond immediate physical danger and into the realm of meaning. Fear of loss, fear of separation, fear of not knowing what comes next. Among these, fear of death holds a special place. Death represents the ultimate uncertainty. It marks the edge of prediction, the limit of planning. When awareness is believed to end completely at that boundary, fear gains enormous influence. Decisions become urgent, control becomes valuable, stability becomes sacred. This is not a moral failing. It is a natural psychological response. When people believe that life is a single, fragile window that closes permanently, they are more likely to seek certainty. Predictable structures become comforting. Clear rules offer safety. Systems that promise order feel reassuring. From this perspective, fear of death acts as a stabilizing force. It encourages conformity, planning, and adherence to shared frameworks. It supports institutions not because they are manipulative, but because they provide a sense of continuity in the face of uncertainty. Religion, politics, economics, education, and medicine all evolved in part to help societies manage fear. Not just fear of death, but fear of chaos, fear of loss, fear of the unknown. When these systems function well, they reduce anxiety and promote cooperation. They create shared narratives that help people orient themselves in the world. But every stabilizing force has a side effect. When fear becomes the primary motivator, curiosity narrows, exploration becomes risky. Ideas that soften the finality of death can feel destabilizing, even threatening, because they undermine the emotional foundation on which certainty is built. If death is not an absolute end, then urgency changes. Control loosens. The pressure to secure meaning within a single lifetime softens. This does not mean people stop caring. It means they may care differently. From the standpoint of large systems, this shift can feel uncomfortable, not because anyone is plotting against it, but because systems thrive on predictability. They rely on consistent patterns of behaviour. Fear is a powerful tool for maintaining those patterns. When fear decreases, motivation does not vanish, it transforms. People may become less driven by accumulation and more by presence, less focused on legacy and more on relationship, less concerned with winning and more with understanding. This transformation is subtle, but profound. It helps explain why ideas about consciousness continuing beyond death often remain at the margins, not because they are forbidden, but because they challenge the emotional equilibrium that many systems depend on. It also explains why such ideas often provoke strong reactions. Fear does not always express itself as panic. It can appear as skepticism, dismissal, or ridicule. These responses serve to restore stability by closing the door on uncertainty. Again, no villains are required. This is how human psychology works. We gravitate toward explanations that preserve a sense of control. We resist those that introduce ambiguity, especially around matters as fundamental as death. What's interesting is that this resistance mirrors the perceptual filtering we've discussed throughout this journey. Just as the brain filters sensory information to maintain functional awareness, societies filter ideas to maintain functional order. Both filters are adaptive, both reduce overwhelm, and both limit what is seen. When ideas about the afterlife are framed dramatically, they trigger fear and defensiveness. But when they are framed gently, as shifts in perspective rather than promises or threats, they can be felt without destabilization. This is why the approach matters. The perspective explored here does not demand belief in immortality. It does not offer certainty about what happens after death. It simply suggests that awareness may not be as fragile as we often assume. For some, even this suggestion is enough to soften fear. For others, it may feel irrelevant. Both responses are valid. The goal is not to replace one source of fear with another. It is to notice how fear operates quietly, shaping attention and belief. As you listen now, you might notice how your own body responds to the topic of death. Perhaps there is tension, perhaps there is neutrality, perhaps there is curiosity, there is no correct response. What matters is recognizing that fear is not the only possible relationship to uncertainty. There is also wonder and patience and trust in processes larger than immediate control. If consciousness continues beyond the body, fear of death may naturally soften. But even if it does not, simply acknowledging the limits of certainty can be calming. It relieves the pressure to know everything now. As the night deepens, fear tends to loosen its grip. The mind grows less vigilant. The body relaxes. In this state, it becomes easier to see fear not as an enemy, but as a signal, a reminder of where attachment lies. When attachment softens, even slightly, new ways of being become possible. Perhaps the most reassuring aspect of this exploration is that nothing needs to be forced. Fear does not need to be eliminated. It can be understood. An understanding often reduces its intensity naturally. The idea that you might already be embedded in something larger than this. Single life does not require dramatic change. It simply invites a gentler pace, a quieter urgency. In that quiet, fear becomes less of a driver and more of a background sensation, present, but no longer in control. And when fear steps back, even a little, awareness has more room to rest. As the role of fear settles into a quieter understanding, another layer of the story becomes visible, not at the level of individual psychology, but at the level of structure, the systems through which knowledge moves, the paths ideas must travel to be seen, heard, and taken seriously. It is tempting to imagine that ideas remain marginal because they are suppressed, hidden, or deliberately ignored. But most of the time, nothing so dramatic is required. Ideas drift to the margins because of how systems naturally organize themselves. Science, like the brain, is a filtering process. It does not absorb everything equally. It selects, it prioritizes, it focuses attention where progress seems most likely, where tools already exist and where outcomes can be predicted. This is not a flaw. It is what allows science to function at all. Without filtering, inquiry would dissolve into noise. Funding agencies must decide what to support. Journals must decide what to publish. Universities must decide what research paths are worth building careers around. Each decision is made under uncertainty, limited resources, and the pressure to produce reliable results. In such an environment, caution becomes rational. Research that fits established frameworks feels safer. It is easier to evaluate, easier to replicate, easier to defend. Research that challenges foundational assumptions, especially about something as elusive as consciousness, carries risk. Not because it is wrong, but because it is difficult. Difficulty translates into uncertainty. Uncertainty translates into career risk, and career risk quietly shapes the landscape of inquiry more powerfully than ideology ever could. A young researcher choosing a topic is not asking, What is most interesting? They're often asking what can be funded, what can be published, what will allow me to continue working. These questions do not require censorship to guide outcomes. They require only incentives. Ideas that sit comfortably within existing models move forward smoothly. Ideas that require new instruments, new language, or new criteria for evidence move slowly, if at all. This is especially true for questions about consciousness beyond the brain. Such questions are difficult to operationalize. They resist simple experiments. They blur the line between subjective report and objective measurement. They demand interdisciplinary thinking that does not fit neatly into established departments. As a result, they tend to remain at the edges, not rejected outright, but rarely prioritized. This dynamic mirrors the perceptual filter we've been discussing throughout this journey. Just as the brain filters sensory information to maintain functional awareness, institutions filter ideas to maintain functional stability. Both processes reduce overwhelm, both increase efficiency, and both limit what is visible. Importantly, neither process requires malicious intent. No one needs to conspire to keep certain ideas marginal. The system does it on its own, through incentives and inertia, through habits formed over decades, through reward structures that favour refinement over reinvention. Understanding this removes much of the emotional charge from the issue. Ideas about consciousness continuing beyond death are not dangerous, they're simply inconvenient. They do not fit easily into existing methods. They do not promise quick results. They complicate rather than simplify, and complication is expensive. This does not mean that science is closed-minded. On the contrary, science has repeatedly expanded its boundaries when new tools made previously invisible phenomena accessible. What remains outside today may move inside tomorrow. The key is timing. History shows that many ideas appear long before they can be properly tested. Continental drift was proposed decades before evidence could support it. The existence of atoms was debated long before instruments could observe them directly. In these cases, the ideas were not wrong. They were early. The same may be true for certain questions about consciousness. Not necessarily the conclusions people draw, but the willingness to ask whether awareness might extend beyond current models. As you listen now, notice how this structural perspective feels different from blame or suspicion. It does not ask you to distrust institutions, it asks you to understand them. Systems behave predictably because they must. They conserve energy. They reduce risk. They stabilize knowledge. But stability is not the same as completeness. Every stable system leaves something out, not because it wants to, but because it cannot hold everything at once. This realization can be strangely calming. It means that uncertainty does not signal failure. It signals the presence of boundaries. And boundaries by their nature are temporary. As awareness evolves, as tools improve, as language becomes more precise, what once sat at the margins can move inward, quietly, gradually, without drama. Until then, ideas about the afterlife framed as shifts in perception rather than destinations may remain peripheral, not because they threaten science, but because they ask science to slow down and listen in ways it has not yet mastered. For the individual listener, this perspective offers relief. You do not need institutions to validate your inner experiences. You do not need studies to confirm every intuition. You can hold curiosity without demanding endorsement. At the same time, you do not need to reject science or replace it with belief. You can allow both to coexist, each operating within its strengths. As the night deepens, this balanced stance feels easier to maintain. There is less urgency to resolve debates, less need to choose sides. You can simply recognize that knowledge unfolds in layers, that today's margins often become tomorrow's foundations, and that patience is not passivity. It is alignment with how understanding actually grows. Perhaps the most fitting metaphor here is the one we began with. Just as you wear perceptual sunglasses to navigate the world efficiently, societies wear conceptual sunglasses to navigate knowledge. These lenses reduce glare, they make movement possible, but every lens also hides part of the spectrum. And sometimes, simply remembering that the lens exists is enough. You don't need to remove it, you don't need to shatter it, you only need to know that reality is richer than what it currently reveals. That knowledge alone can soften the sense of finality. It can ease the fear of being excluded from truth. As you rest now, allow that softness to settle. You are not behind. You're not missing out. You're simply living inside a system that, like your own mind, reveals reality in manageable portions, and beyond those portions, something wider patiently waits, not to be proven tonight, just to be acknowledged. As this long exploration begins to slow, it may help to notice something subtle. Throughout everything we've considered, there has been no instruction to reach anywhere new, no destination to arrive at, no final answer waiting at the end, only a gradual shift in how things are seen. If the afterlife is not a place you go but a layer of reality you're already embedded in, then something interesting happens. The pressure to prepare for death begins to soften. The urgency to secure meaning before time runs out relaxes its grip. Life stops feeling like a test. Instead of being a narrow corridor rushing toward an ending, life begins to resemble an interface, a temporary mode of experience, a way for awareness to encounter limits, contrast, and specificity. This reframing does not make life less important. It makes it more intimate. When life is seen as a single, fragile chance, it can feel heavy. Every mistake feels costly. Every delay feels dangerous. Every moment carries the weight of not being wasted. But when life is seen as one expression of something ongoing, the tone changes. Moments no longer need to justify themselves. They can simply be lived. Work becomes less about proving worth and more about participating. Relationships become less about securing permanence and more about presence. Fear of failure loosens because nothing essential is at stake in the way it once seemed. This does not mean indifference, it means gentleness. Consider how you already treat experiences you know are temporary, a sunset, a song, a quiet conversation late at night. Their impermanence does not make them meaningless, it makes them precious without pressure. If physical life is a filtered experience of awareness, then its limits are not flaws. They are features. They allow focus. They create contrast. They give shape to experience. Pain hurts precisely because sensation is narrowed. Joy feels sharp because attention is localized. Loss matters because connection feels bounded. None of this needs to be fixed. From this perspective, death is not a cliff. It is a transition out of a particular mode of focus, like waking from a dream or setting down a tool that has been used well. And just as waking from a dream does not erase the dream's value, transitioning out of physical life does not erase the meaning of what was lived. This view changes how fear behaves. Fear does not vanish, but it loses its authority. It becomes one signal among many, rather than the final arbiter of decisions. You may still avoid harm, you may still care deeply, but the background tension softens. Even compassion shifts. When others are seen as expressions of the same awareness moving through different filters, patience grows more naturally. Judgments lose some of their sharpness. Differences feel less threatening. This does not require belief. It requires only perspective. As you lie here now listening, notice how little effort awareness actually needs. Breathing happens on its own. Thoughts drift without instruction. Sensations arise and fade. You're not holding consciousness together. It is holding experience together for you. This quiet observation is important. If awareness were fragile, it would demand constant maintenance, but it does not. Even as the body rests, awareness remains. Even as attention drifts, presence continues. This continuity is easy to miss during busy days, but at night, when the world grows quieter, it becomes easier to feel. Nothing needs to be reached tonight. You do not need to understand consciousness fully. You do not need to decide what happens after death. You do not need to resolve uncertainty. You're already participating in the thing you're trying to comprehend. Awareness does not stand outside life, analysing it. It experiences life from within, through forms that come and go. From this view, the afterlife is not postponed. It is not earned. It is not unlocked. It is simply what remains when a particular filter relaxes, and until that time, living gently inside the filter becomes the practice. Listening more than rushing, allowing more than forcing, trusting that not everything meaningful needs to be controlled or explained. As sleep approaches, you may notice how naturally the mind lets go. Plans loosen, identity softens, time becomes less insistent. Sleep itself is a small rehearsal, a daily reminder that awareness can withdraw from effort without disappearing. You don't fear falling asleep because you trust that something continues. That same trust can quietly extend to larger transitions without needing to be named or defended. So tonight, there is nothing to prepare for, nothing to solve, nothing to reach, only rest. If awareness continues, it will continue on its own terms. If it changes form, it will do so naturally. And if this moment is all there is, then this moment is already enough. You're not late. You're not missing anything. You are exactly where awareness experiences being human for now. And that in itself is complete.